Welcome to the Anagi Observer. My name is Steve Gearhart. I have a quick question for you. How would you feel if you had to go to a store to find your favorite manga or the latest issue of Shonen Jump or whatever manga magazine you happen to like? You had to go to the store and you could rent it but not own it, just as if you were renting a DVD. How would you think? How would you feel about that? And that is the concept of a Kashi-on or Kashi-hon'ya. Depends on how you want to pronounce it. Kashi-ons have been around, or had been around in Japan for a long time. They started around the beginning of the Edo area, which was about 1603. And as of today, there's really nobody's really sure how many are left. Some people think it's only one, but it's definitely only a handful. Not very many are left at all. And Kashi-ons were a place in the 20th century and today. They are places where you can rent specifically manga, and really nothing else. But Kashi-ons were not always that way. What they were was they were paid libraries. So back in the Edo period, back in the 1600s, what would happen is that unless you were a nobleman or a rich merchant who could afford a library, who could afford to actually purchase and own a book, you had to rent them. Now these guys were actually traveling libraries, traveling paid libraries. So they would go around in a particular geographic area and they would kind of drum up clients and say, figure out who's literate. And by the way, at this time, Japan was, in comparative to other countries, pretty literate. So it was a good business to be in, to run a Kashi-on. So these guys who would run the Kashi-ons, they would have this big cart of books and they would go around and they would say, okay, you're going to pay me X to be able to read this book. And you would pay X to read that book. Now, he would then take your name or make a code for you or whatever, and then he would leave to go on his circuit with the understanding that when he came back around to your village and he knew who you were, he would come up to you and go, do you still have my book? Yes, I do. Okay, can I have it back? Certainly, thank you very much. And would you like to rent another book? Yes, I would. And that's how they would do business. Now, if you lost a book, you had to pay the guy back. And that was a lot of money. And the reason why it was a lot of money was not that paper was scarce, it was just hard to make. The technology wasn't really there to industrialize the making of paper. So that's kind of the reason why books were so expensive. As years went on, Kashi-ons kind of grew in popularity to the point where they were, instead of traveling, they were able to set up shop in certain places. So if you lived in a city, in a Japanese city, you would have a lot of Kashi-ons around you that you could walk down the block and go in and find one and rent a book. So how did it become manga specific? Well, as Japan grew technologically, as the Edo period ended and the Meiji Restoration happened, and as Japan decided, hey, let's try to keep our old ways, but at the same time keep up with the Western world, we're going to do things a little bit differently. So while there were Kashi-ons, and they were paid libraries, what started happening was that they started collecting more things. They started collecting more things like comic books and manga and certain types of media of the day. And they would have them there for anyone who would want to rent them. And as Japan got more technologically advanced, paper was a little bit easier to make. It became a little bit cheaper. People still couldn't quite afford massive libraries, but they could afford small ones. And what they couldn't afford, they could always rent. So during the war years, all media in Japan went towards the war effort. So everything was a propaganda piece. Kashi-ons did a good enough business in promoting propaganda. Propaganda, manga, comics, those kinds of things. So then World War II happened, and Japan lost. Now, in a war is usually tough on everybody, even the people who are winning, like the United States. In the United States, we still had to ration gas. We had tin drives where people would bring in their pots and pans and pile them out outside the local cinema for recycling, and things like that. And that's us on the winning side. For the Japanese who lost, what happens when you lose a war is your economy is destroyed because you've been on war footing for so long. And now that there's no more war, there's no more production. Not only for economic reasons, but also because it's probably been bombed out. So there's no industry, there's no jobs, there's no employment, and it's really hard to make things. The country is in ruins economically and physically. The infrastructure is destroyed. So where are you going to get the paper to make manga? You're not. So the publishers, realizing that they cannot produce as many books as they used to, realized that they could use the Kashi-hon'yas. So the Kashi-hon'yas grew in number. Like, they went from like a few hundred to a couple thousand to like 30 to 40,000. And the reason is because the publishers realized, well, hey, we don't have to publish out 100,000 copies of a magazine. We can do 20,000 copies and spread it out amongst the Kashi-hon'yas, and we can take our royalties from when they rent it out. So that's what publishers did. And they did that with manga books at the same time, and the comic books. And yes, there is a difference between manga and comics, but that's a subject for another day. So what happened was that because Japan didn't have the industry to make the paper again, paper was expensive, so they limited the amount of copies that they made and had the Kashi-hon'yas make the money for them. So what about the manga artists? What about the comic book artists? What about the guys who worked on the magazines? What about those guys? How much money did they make? Almost nothing. Much like today, the artist is the one who gets screwed over. They got paid a flat fee, and that's it. Their publisher would probably also be their manager sometimes, a lot of the time. So the manga artists made almost no money. They made a flat fee, barely enough to feed themselves and their family. Meanwhile, the publisher would take their work, make a few copies of it, sell it to a Kashi-bon. A Kashi-bon would make money off of it, give royalties back to the publisher, and that's how they make their money. Meanwhile, the manga artist, he gets this little bad check that sometimes even bounced, and that was it. But because there were so many Kashi-bons, if you were a good enough manga artist and you created a title that was popular, that kind of helped you. So why did they decline? Why did they go from 30 to 40,000 to like a handful or maybe even just one left in Japan? Very simple. Japan got better. As American occupation went on, we helped them rebuild their country. They rebuilt their country, they rebuilt their economy to the point where they were self-sufficient. They had enough industrial capacity to make paper, literally. So the cost of paper went from way up in the stratosphere, and it came down to the point where the publishers didn't need the Kashi-hon'yas anymore. They could publish and sell it direct to a wholesaler who would sell it direct to a retailer who would then be you or I, and we would pay the money. And again, the manga artists got paid a flat fee, maybe a little teeny tiny royalty, and that's about it. So the Kashi-hon'yas were not needed anymore. But the Kashi-hon'yas have one last impact. They're the ones that threw out the idea of the Gekiga manga. Beforehand, manga was, as you know, very, kind of cartoonish, and they can be very silly, very short stories. Maybe they have very short storylines that go over maybe only 2 or 3 issues. Gekiga are adult manga books. And they are the people who wanted the Gekiga books were the very same people who 10 years earlier were going to the Kashi-hon'yas. So they created the desire for an adult book, which is kind of what we know manga as today. Now, does that mean that Kashi-hon'yas are totally gone and disappeared? Physically, maybe, but not in spirit. Think about it. Here in America and in Europe, there are still pay libraries where you have to pay an annual fee, or there are items that you still have to pay a very base cost to it. Like my library here in Baltimore, the Pratt Library, I have to pay $1 to rent a recent movie from their stacks, or or if you actually go to a large enough convention, you will find a kind of like a manga cafe or a manga library where you can go in and pull a book off and sit down and read it. So in spirit, there are still Kashi-hon'yas all over the place. It's just that the business isn't there anymore. So that's why there's like maybe one left in Japan. And that was your history lesson for today or for this week. If you liked it, if you want to see more of this kind of thing, click like down below and let me know that you like this. If you like in generally what I do here, please subscribe. That would be awesome if you subscribe. Please subscribe. I'd love you to have you as a subscriber. Anyway, this is the Unagi Observer. My name is Steve Gerhardt. Thanks for watching. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.